The wind in the Bighorn Mountains has 1,000 voices. It can whisper through the pines like a lover, or it can scream like a banshee clawing at the world. But on that night, as the great white death of a blizzard buried everything under a shroud of ice, it carried a new sound. A sound so faint, so fragile, it was almost nothing. It was the cry of a woman, a sound of hope dying in the heart of the storm. She had been left for dead, a sacrifice to the unforgiving Wyoming winter. But the storm in its fury carried her plea to the one man who could hear it, a silent tracker, who understood the secrets of the wild, a man who would soon face a choice between the ghosts of his past and the fragile life freezing in a forgotten cabin. The first flakes of snow were a lie. They drifted down from a sky the color of a dull pewter coin, lazy and beautiful, each one a perfect, intricate star. Abigail watched them from the single small window of the cabin, her hand resting on the firm, round swell of her belly. The baby was quiet today, nestled deep as if it too could sense the change in the air, the deep resonant hush that had fallen over the Bighorn Mountains. "It's just a squall," Abby Jedediah had said. That morning, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful in the small, cramped space. "Be back before supper. Just need to fetch that last bundle of salt and flour from Miller's Pass before the real snows set in for the season." She had nodded, wanting to believe him, but a worm of unease had been burrowing in her gut for weeks. It wasn't just the early onset of winter that felt wrong. It was Jedediah himself. The easy smile he once wore now seemed brittle, a mask that would crack if you looked too closely. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, now darted about, never quite meeting hers, always scanning the horizon as if expecting some terrible apparition to rise from the jagged peaks. He'd been a good man, or so she believed. The man who had courted her back in Laramie was full of grand dreams and honeyed words painting pictures of a life carved out of the wilderness rich with freedom and the promise of gold. He'd found this spot, a small abandoned trapper's cabin nestled in a high valley miles from any real town. A temporary home, my love, he'd promised, until I find our fortune. Now, as she watched him saddle Clementine, their sturdiest mule, that promise felt as thin as the threadbare blanket on their bed. He wasn't packing light for a quick trip to Miller's Pass. He was taking the heavy oilskin coat, the one she'd spent weeks saving for. He was packing extra ammunition for his Colt Peacemaker, and he was carefully wrapping the last of the salted pork. It was the packing of a man who wasn't sure when his next real meal would be. "Jed," she said, her voice soft, stepping out onto the porch. The cold was already sharp, a blade against her cheeks. "That looks like more than you need for a day trip." He didn't turn around, busy tightening the cinch. "The wind's got a bite to it. Can't be too careful. You know these mountains. Take the old mare. Clementine is slower, but she's sure-footed. The pass can be treacherous." He finally stopped, his shoulders stiff. He turned, and for a moment the mask slipped. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, fear raw and stark, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a strained patience. "Abby, don't you fuss. I need Clementine's strength. It's a heavy load coming back." He walked over and placed a cold, quick kiss on her forehead. His lips were thin and dry. "You just keep the fire stoked. I'll be back before you know it. Sing to the little one for me." He swung himself into the saddle, a man running from a ghost only he could see. He didn't look back. Not once. He just spurred Clementine forward, disappearing into the thickening curtain of snow. leaving Abigail alone with the hollow echo of his words and a pile of firewood that suddenly looked terrifyingly small. For the first hour, she did as he asked. She stoked the fire, humming a lullaby, telling herself the unease was just the pregnancy, the isolation playing tricks on her mind. But then the wind began to pick up. The lazy flakes turned into a frantic horizontal swarm. The whisper in the pines became a low, guttural moan that vibrated through the log walls of the cabin. By noon, the world outside the window had vanished. There was no mountain, no sky, only a swirling, blinding chaos of white. The temperature plummeted. A draught cold as a grave digger's touch snaked its way through the chinking in the walls. The fire, which had been her cheerful companion, was now a desperate, hungry thing, devouring the logs she fed it with an alarming speed. She went to the woodpile he'd left on the porch. It was a lie. He'd stacked the logs cleverly, leaving a hollow space in the middle. What looked like a full day's supply was barely enough to last the night. That was the moment the cold dread in her stomach bloomed into full-blown terror. It wasn't just the storm. It was the calculated nature of it all. The best mule, the extra supplies, the hollow wood pile. He hadn't gone to Miller's Pass. He had fled, and he had left her behind. Why? The question screamed in her mind, louder than the howling wind. Was it another woman? Debts, was he simply a coward, terrified of the responsibility of a wife and a child in this unforgiving land? Her mind reeled, searching for an answer for any reason that could staunch the bleeding wound of his betrayal. The cabin grew colder. The fire shrank, its light and warmth receding, pulling back from the corners of the room, which were now surrendering to the creeping frost. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from the violent shudders of a broken heart. She was alone, heavily pregnant and alone in a tomb of ice, with nothing but a dying fire between her and the white death that raged outside. Sobs racked her body, raw and desperate. She pressed her face into her hands, but the tears froze on her cheeks. She cried out his name, a ragged, hopeless sound that was instantly devoured by the storm. Then she cried out for help, to a God she wasn't sure was listening her voice a thin thread against the fabric of the blizzard's roar. She didn't know it, but the wind, that fickle messenger, was carrying her plea. It was carrying the sound of her despair across the frozen landscape, past the groaning pines, and over the buried ridgelines, towards the ears of a man who moved through the storm like a phantom. Silas didn't feel the cold, not in the way other men did. For him, the cold was just a state of being, a familiar pressure against the hardened leather of his skin. He'd been born in the shadow of the Tetons, had spent most of his 40 years living in the spaces between towns in the vast, silent cathedrals of the wilderness. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts by solitude and survival. His face was a map of hard trails and harder winters, his eyes the color of a winter sky. Just before the dawn, missing nothing. He wasn't tracking a grizzly, not this time. He was tracking something far more dangerous, a memory. He'd been passing through the Bighorn Range heading south before the deep snows made the high passes impassable when the storm had ambushed him. It was a freak storm, unnaturally powerful, a sudden violent convulsion of nature that spoke of a season thrown out of balance. He'd been making for a sheltered cave, he knew, of a place marked only in the atlas of his own mind when he first heard it. At first he dismissed it. The wind in the bighorns played tricks. It could mimic the cry of a panther, the whistle of a train, the laughter of a child. It was a liar and a mimic. He pulled the collar of his heavy buffalo coat higher and urged his horse, a stoic grey stallion named Ghost, onward through the deepening drifts. Ghost was a creature of the mountains, as silent and resilient as his master, and he moved through the blizzard with a steady, ground-eating pace. But the sound came again. It wasn't the wind. The wind was a steady, deafening roar, a physical force that pushed and pulled and screamed. This was something else. A thin, high-pitched thread of sound, woven through the gale, almost imperceptible. It would rise for a moment, a note of pure human anguish, and then be snatched away by the storm. An animal. A mountain cat caught in a rockslide numb. He knew the sounds of this world as well as he knew the lines on his own hands. Every cry of every creature had its own texture, its own reason. This sound was different. It was freighted with a sorrow that no animal could voice. It was the sound of a soul breaking. He stopped, Ghost pulling the horse into the relative shelter of a thick stand of lodgepole pines. The snow swirled around them, a dizzying vortex of white. Silas closed his eyes, tilting his head. His entire being focused on that one act of listening. He was a hunter, but his prey was now a sound. He filtered out the shriek of the wind, the groaning of the snow-laden branches, the drumming of his own heart. He listened for the space between the noises. There it was again. Fainter this time, but unmistakable. A human cry. A woman's cry, a fool's errand. That's what the logical part of his mind told him. To leave his path, to abandon the certainty of shelter, and chase a ghost sound through a killer blizzard was suicide. The person was likely already dead, their last breath, a frozen puff in the wind. Or worse, it could be a trap. The West was full of stories of renegades and desperate men using tricks to lure unwary travelers. But Silas operated on a different kind of logic, an instinct honed by 1,000 silent sunrises and a past he could never outrun. He knew what it was to be alone and hopeless. Years ago, on a different mountain, in a different blizzard, he had failed to hear a cry for help. The memory was a hold-hard stone in his gut, a ghost that walked with him every day. He had lost his own family, a wife and a daughter, not to a storm, but to a sickness that had swept through their small homestead while he was away on a long trapping expedition. He had returned to a silent cabin, a place where laughter had once lived, and the silence had nearly broken him. It was a silence he had carried inside him ever since. He would not fail again, not if there was a breath of a chance. He dismounted, giving Ghost a reassuring pat on the neck. "Stay close, old friend," he murmured, his voice a low rumble swallowed by the storm. The horse seemed to understand, nudging his master's shoulder with its head. Silas pulled a pair of crude snowshoes from his pack, strapping them to his worn leather boots. He checked the load in his Sharps rifle, a habit as ingrained as breathing. With the rifle in one hand and a long walking staff in the other, he turned his face into the wind towards the direction of the faint, desperate sound. The world was a maelstrom of white noise and biting ice. Visibility was less than 10 feet. Every step was a battle against the wind and the sucking drifts. The snow was up to his knees and in places up to his waist. He moved not by sight, but by feel, by the slope of the land beneath his feet and the subtle changes in the wind's direction. He was a ship navigating a raging, featureless sea. For what felt like an hour, he heard nothing but the storm's fury. The cold began to work its way through the layers of wool and buffalo hide, a dull ache in his bones. Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp as an icicle. Had he imagined it? Was he chasing a phantom born of his own grief? He was about to turn back to admit defeat to the storm, when the wind lulled for a single miraculous second. And in that brief pocket of silence, he heard it again. Clearer this time. It was a sob, a ragged, convulsive sound of utter despair. It was closer, much closer. Hope and emotion Silas rarely allowed himself surged through him, a welcome warmth against the encroaching chill. He wasn't chasing a ghost. He was tracking a life. He adjusted his course, leaning into the wind, his long legs pumping with renewed purpose. He pushed forward, a silent, relentless force, moving through the heart of the white death, drawn on by the breaking heart of a stranger. Inside the cabin, the world had shrunk to the size of a small, sputtering circle of light. The fire was a pathetic thing now, a handful of glowing embers in a bed of grey ash. Abigail had burned everything she could. The spare chair, the empty crate that had held their potatoes, even the book of poetry Jedediah had given her during their courtship. The pages had curled, turned black, and vanished into smoke, taking their sweet words with them. The cold was no longer a draught. It was a presence. It was a heavy weight, pressing in on all sides. Frost, thick and white as a burial shroud, had conquered the walls, crawling in intricate fern-like patterns across the floorboards. When she exhaled, her breath plumed in front of her, a visible ghost of the life still left in her. Her body trembled violently, uncontrollably. She was huddled on the floor, as close to the dying embers as she dared, wrapped in the one blanket and a spare canvas tarp. But the cold was coming from within now. It was a deep internal chill that no fire could touch. Fear for her baby was a hot, sharp poker in her heart. She talked to it, her whispers lost in the storm's symphony. "It's all right, little one. It's all right. Mama's here. We just have to be strong. We just have to wait." But the words were a lie, and she knew it. Wait for what? For Jedediah to return his conscience, having won a battle she no longer believed it was capable of fighting, or for the fire to die completely, leaving them to the tender mercies of the frost. A sharp, cramping pain seized her abdomen, making her gasp. It was different from the baby's usual movements. This was a fierce, clenching fist deep inside her. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the dull fog of hypothermia. Was it labor? Was it possible? Here now. The thought was so monstrous, so utterly terrifying that her mind recoiled from it. No. It was just the cold, the stress. It had to be. Delirium began to set in its tendrils, weaving through her thoughts. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe and dance. The howl of the wind began to sound like voices, whispering her name, whispering accusations. She saw Jedediah's face in the patterns of the frost on the window pane, his eyes full of a cold indifference. She thought of her father, a stern blacksmith back in Ohio, how he had warned her against Jedediah. "He's a man in love with the horizon, girl. Men like that are always running from something, and they'll leave you standing in their dust." She had dismissed it as the overprotective grumbling of an old man. Now his words returned to her with the brutal clarity of prophecy. The pain came again, sharper this time, stealing her breath. A low moan escaped her lips, involuntary, a sound of pure animal suffering. She curled into a tighter ball, pressing her hands against her belly as if she could physically hold the baby and keep it safe from this frozen, hostile world. Suddenly, over the roar of the wind, There was another sound, a scraping, thumping noise at the door. Her head snapped up, her heart lurching in her chest. Jedediah. Had he come back? A wild, impossible hope flared within her. He hadn't abandoned her. He'd been caught in the storm, had fought his way back for her. Jed. She called out, her voice a raw, cracked thing. Jed, is that you? The only answer was a heavy, splintering crack. The wooden bar that secured the door from the inside, weakened by the intense cold, shuddered in its brackets. Then came a tremendous thud, a solid impact of heavy shoulder against wood. The bar snapped. The door flew open, torn from its frozen frame, and crashed inward onto the floor. A figure stood in the doorway, a giant silhouetted against the swirling white chaos of the blizzard. It was a man, but he seemed more a part of the storm itself, immense and menacing. He was covered in snow and ice, a rifle in one hand, his face obscured by a thick, frozen beard and the shadow of a low-brimmed hat. He was a monster, conjured from the blizzard's heart. This was not Jedediah. This was not a rescuer. In Abigail's frost-addled mind, this was the thing Jedediah had been running from. This was the terror that had been haunting his eyes. It had come for them. He had sacrificed her to it, leaving her as bait. Primal fear, the instinct of a mother protecting her young, surged through her, momentarily burning away the cold and the delirium. She scrambled backward away from the figure, her hand closing around the only weapon she had left, a thick piece of firewood she had saved for the last dregs of the fire. It was heavy and solid in her hand. The man took a step into the cabin, bringing a swirl of snow and a blast of Arctic air with him. He kicked the broken door shut, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the faint, pulsing glow of the embers. He stood there, a towering shadow, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. I heard a cry, he said. His voice was a low, rough baritone, like rocks grinding together. It was not a voice of comfort. It was the voice of the wilderness, hard and uncompromising. But Abigail didn't hear the words. She only heard the threat. She saw the rifle, the imposing size of him, the predatory stillness in his posture. He was a wolf, and she was trapped. "Get back!" she hissed, raising the log, her knuckles white. "Get out of my house!" Silas stood perfectly still, his eyes now accustomed to the dim light. He saw her, then truly saw her. Not just a shape, but a woman, wild-eyed with terror, her face pale and gaunt, her body swollen with child. He saw the desperation, the fierce protective fire in her eyes, and he understood. He was not a savior to her. He was just another man, another threat in a world that had clearly shown her nothing but cruelty. He did not raise his hands to show he was unarmed, a gesture he knew might be misinterpreted as a prelude to attack. Instead, he did something that went against every instinct of a man used to conflict. He slowly, deliberately leaned his sharps rifle against the wall, placing it out of his own easy reach. He unbuckled his gun belt, the one holding his Colt revolver, and let it drop with a soft thud to the floor. He took a slow, deliberate step back towards the door, increasing the distance between them. "The storm," he said, his voice still low, but softer this time, gentler. "It's a bad one. The White Death. You can't survive it with a fire that small." Abigail's grip on the log did not loosen. Her eyes darted from his face to the rifle, then back again. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and suspicion. Was this a trick? A ruse to get her to lower her guard? "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but fierce. What do you want?" Silas looked at the dying embers, then at the frost-covered walls. He looked at the terror in her eyes, and he saw the ghost of another woman in another silent cabin, a ghost he had vowed to never see again. "My name is Silas," he said, his gaze steady and direct, holding hers. "And right now, all I want is to keep that fire from going out." The standoff held for a long, breathless moment. The only sounds were the scream of the wind outside and Abigail's ragged breathing within. She watched Silas, every muscle in her body, tensed her mind, a battlefield of instinct and terror. He remained perfectly still, a statue carved from winter, and Patience, his large, calloused hands, held open at his sides away from his weapons. There was no aggression in his posture, only a profound weariness, as if he carried the weight of the storm on his shoulders. Slowly, like a thawing river, the fight began to drain out of her. The heavy log grew heavier. The adrenaline that had sharpened her fear began to recede, leaving behind the deep, aching cold and a bone-deep exhaustion. This man. He had disarmed himself. He had made no move toward her. His eyes, she saw now, were not cruel. They were filled with a sorrow she felt she could almost understand. Her arm trembled, and the log dropped from her nerveless fingers, thudding softly onto the dirt floor. A dry sob escaped her throat, and she sagged against the wall, the last of her strength gone. Silas took that as his cue. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, not approaching her directly, but turning his attention to the task at hand. He retrieved the broken door, propping it back in its frame as best he could, using a piece of the shattered bar to wedge it shut against the wind. The immediate biting draft was lessened. Then he turned to the fireplace. He knelt before the pathetic embers, his movements methodical. From a leather pouch on his belt, he produced a tinderbox and a small, dry bundle of birch bark and fine wood shavings. He handled the embers with a practiced gentleness, coaxing them, feeding them slivers of bark. He blew on them softly, his breath steady and controlled until a tiny, fragile flame flickered to life. Abigail watched him mesmerized. He had brought his own kindling. He had come prepared for this, for survival. He took the very log she had threatened him with, and with a few powerful blows from a small hatchet he retrieved from his pack, split it into smaller, more manageable pieces. He fed the new flame, nursing it patiently, until it grew into a confident, crackling fire that began to push back the oppressive gloom and the deadly cold. Warmth, real warmth, began to seep into the cabin. It was the most wonderful sensation Abigail had ever felt. It was life. Silas shrugged off his heavy, snow-caked buffalo coat. Underneath, he was broad-shouldered but lean, wearing simple, durable, homespun clothes. He worked without speaking. His silence a strange comfort after the hollow promises of Jedediah. He retrieved a small pot from his own pack, went to the corner where her water barrel stood, and broke the thick layer of ice on top with the butt of his hatchet. He filled the pot and set it near the fire to warm. Finally, he looked at her. "You need to get closer to the heat," he said, his voice still that low baritone. "And drink some warm water. The cold steals the life out of you." She obeyed without question, shuffling on her hands and knees until the fire's heat washed over her face. It felt like a benediction. He handed her a tin cup of steaming water. Her hands shook so violently that he had to steady them with his own. His hand was large and rough-scarred and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. As the warmth and water began to revive her, her mind cleared further. The terror subsided, replaced by a flood of questions. How? How did you find me? Silas was examining the cabin now, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The meager supplies, the empty shelves. His gaze lingered on the floor near the hearth. "I heard you," he said, simply not looking at her. The wind carried the sound. The wind. Such a simple, impossible explanation. As he scanned the room, his eyes narrowed. He knelt by the floorboards near where she had been huddled. Jedediah had pried up one of the planks a few days ago, claiming he was looking for a draft. He'd nailed it back down clumsily. Silas noticed the fresh scratches on the wood, the slightly raised nail heads. Something about it drew his attention. He pulled a long, thin skinning knife from a sheath on his belt. Using its tip, he carefully worked at the edges of the plank. It came up with a low groan. Underneath, in the shallow space above the dirt foundation, lay a small oilskin-wrapped package. It was not a bundle of money or a lost heirloom. Silas picked it up and unwrapped it. Inside was a worn, leather-bound journal and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a crudely drawn map. It showed the surrounding mountains and valleys, but the landmarks were not geographical. They were names. Merton's Folly, Blackwood Gorge, the Widow's Peak. At the center of the map, nestled in a canyon not far from their cabin's location, was an X, marked with the words, "The Cheyenne Star." Abigail stared at the map, confused. "What is that?" Silas's face was grim, the lines around his eyes deepening. He knew the name. Every tracker, prospector, and outlaw in the Wyoming Territory knew it. The Cheyenne Star wasn't a star at all. It was the legendary unofficial name for a lost payroll shipment. Gold bullion meant for the soldiers at Fort Laramie that had vanished without a trace from a Cheyenne and Black Hills stage line coach 2 years prior. The coach was found splintered at the bottom of a ravine, the guards and driver dead, but the gold was gone. It was presumed buried somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Bighorns. He opened the journal. The handwriting was Jedediah's, frantic and looping. The last few entries told a story that made Silas's blood run cold. Jedediah hadn't found the map. He had stolen it from a man he'd killed in a card game gone wrong. The man was a member of the notorious Blackwood Gang, a vicious outfit led by a merciless cutthroat named Elias Merton. The journal was a litany of paranoia and fear. The gang knew Jedediah had the map. They had been hunting him. He'd brought Abigail to this remote cabin, not as a home, but as a place to hide, to lay low, until he could figure out how to retrieve the gold for himself. The final entry, scrawled the day before, was chilling. "They found me. Saw one of their scouts near the ridge yesterday. It's Merton's man. They know I'm here. Can't let them find Abby. Or the map. I have to lead them away. I'll ride east, make them think I'm heading for the flats. It's our only chance. God forgive me." Silas looked up from the journal, his expression hard as granite. He finally understood. Jedediah's departure wasn't simple abandonment. It was a desperate, cowardly, and ultimately foolish gambit. He had fled, leaving Abigail to the storm, hoping the blizzard would cover his tracks and that the Blackwood Gang would follow him, the sole possessor of the map. He was trying to save her life by sacrificing her to the wilderness. But there was a fatal flaw in his plan. Silas had found the map, and if a lone tracker, guided only by a cry on the wind, could find this cabin in the heart of a blizzard, so could a gang of ruthless killers guided by the promise of gold. "Your husband didn't just leave you," Silas said, his voice low and urgent. He handed her the journal. "He left you in the middle of a war." Just then, from outside, came a sound that was not the wind. It was the distinct, sharp whinny of a horse, answered by another. They were close. The storm was a shroud, but it would not hide them forever. The Blackwood gang had arrived. The sound of the horses galvanized Silas. He moved with an explosive, silent speed that belied his size. One moment he was kneeling, the next he was across the room, snatching his Sharps rifle from the wall. He didn't look at Abigail. His entire focus was on the outside world, his senses straining against the muffling blanket of the storm. "Get away from the window," he commanded, his voice a blade of ice. "And stay low. Do not make a sound." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She scrambled away from the firelight, pressing herself into the darkest corner of the cabin, the cold of the log wall seeping through her clothes. She clutched Jedediah's journal to her chest, the truth of his actions 1,000 times heavier than the book itself. He wasn't just a coward, he was a fool who had lit a match in a powder keg and left her to face the explosion. Silas moved to the small, frost-coated window pane. Using the edge of his knife, he scraped away a tiny peephole in the ice no bigger than a silver dollar. The world outside was a churning grey and white nightmare, but through the swirling snow he could make out shapes, dark figures on horseback, huddled together like vultures against the gale, not 20 yards from the cabin. There were 4 of them. They had found the cabin. Jedediah's trail, or what was left of it, must have led them right here. One of the figures dismounted a hulking man in a long, dark coat. He handed his reins to another rider and began to walk slowly toward the cabin. He moved with a confident swagger, even through the deep snow, a man accustomed to violence and taking what he wanted. Silas recognized the profile, the cruel set of his jaw. Elias Merton. Silas backed away from the window, his mind racing. 4 of them. In a flat-out gunfight, the odds were abysmal. The cabin was a flimsy wooden box, offering little protection against determined men with rifles. Their only allies were the storm and the element of surprise. Merton likely assumed the cabin was empty, or that Jedediah was holed up inside alone. He would not be expecting a fight from a seasoned tracker and a pregnant woman. "They think your husband is in here," Silas whispered, his back against the wall next to the door. "They don't know about me. Or you. We use that." He looked at Abigail huddled in the corner. Her face was a mask of terror, but beneath it he saw something else flicker in her eyes, a spark of defiance. The same protective fire he'd seen when he first arrived. She was a mother, and her den was being threatened. "Can you shoot?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "Jedediah tried to teach me once. I couldn't stand the noise." "No matter." He unstrapped his Colt revolver from the gun belt on the floor and crawled over to her, pressing the cold, heavy weapon into her hands. "You know how it works." She nodded hesitantly. "Stay in this corner. It's the safest place. If that door comes open and I'm not the one standing, you pull the trigger. You pull it until it's empty. Do you understand?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she firmed her jaw and gripped the revolver with both hands. "I understand." A loud, authoritative voice boomed from outside, cutting through the wind. "Jedediah Hayes. We know you're in there. We followed your trail clear from the muddy gap. You've got something that belongs to me. You can come out now, and we can settle this like businessmen." or we can burn this shack to the ground with you in it." It was Merton. His voice was laced with a chilling, almost pleasant cruelty. Silas held a finger to his lips, signaling for absolute silence. He didn't answer. Let them wonder. Let their certainty curdle into doubt. Every second of silence was a weapon. Outside, the men waited. The wind howled. The silence from the cabin stretched on. "Don't be a fool," Hayes Merton yelled again, a note of irritation creeping into his tone. "The storm's bad, but we've got all night. My fingers are getting cold. Don't make me get angry." Still, Silas remained silent. He was listening. Listening to their positions, the stamping of their horses, the low murmur of conversation between the other men. He was painting a picture of the battlefield in his mind. Then came a new sound, a scraping along the side wall of the cabin. One of them was circling around to the back. Silas's eyes darted to the rear of the cabin. There was no window there, only solid logs. But there was the chimney built of river stone and mud. A weak point. He looked at Abigail and then at the fireplace. An idea desperate and dangerous took shape. He crept over to the hearth, his movements as fluid and silent as smoke. He pointed to the pot of water he'd set by the fire, which was now steaming. Then he pointed to the fire itself. Abigail's eyes widened as she understood. It was a mad plan. "I don't like this, Elias." Another voice drifted from outside, thin and nervous. "It's too quiet. What if he ain't in there? What if he froze on the trail?" "He's in there," Merton's voice snarled. "The smoke from the chimney proves it. He's trying to wait us out." "Fine. We'll speed things up. Tucker, get the oil." Silas's blood ran cold. They were going to burn them out. They had no time. He gave Abigail a sharp, decisive nod. "Now." Taking a deep breath, her hands trembling. Abigail grabbed the canvas tarp. On the other side of the room, Silas took a firm grip on the pot of boiling water. Together in a single coordinated movement, they acted. Silas lunged for the fireplace and hurled the entire pot of boiling water straight up the chimney flue. At the same instant, Abigail threw the heavy canvas tarp directly onto the fire. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The fire, smothered by the tarp, belched a huge, thick cloud of arid smoke. With its primary escape route blocked by a sudden downpour of scalding water, the smoke had nowhere to go but back down and out into the cabin. The room filled instantly with a choking, blinding black cloud. Outside the man at the back of the cabin, Tucker let out a yelp of pain and shock as a gallon of boiling water and soot erupted from the chimney top, dousing him. Inside, Silas was already moving, using the smoke as cover. He yanked the broken door open and dove out into the blizzard, his Sharps rifle already at his shoulder. He was a wraith emerging from a cloud of smoke. Merton and his other two men were momentarily stunned, their attention diverted by Tucker's screams and the sudden eruption from the cabin. That moment was all Silas needed. The Sharps rifle boomed its deep report, a thunderclap that momentarily silenced the storm. One of the mounted men jerked back in his saddle and fell sideways into the snow, a dark stain spreading on his chest. Silas levered another round into the chamber before the echo had even died. He dropped to one knee, making himself a smaller target, the snow and smoke swirling around him. The siege had been broken. The battle for the frozen cabin had begun. The world exploded into chaos. The remaining outlaw by the horses, a young man with panicked eyes, fumbled for his pistol. his shots going wild, swallowed by the wind and the thick, roiling smoke still pouring from the cabin door. Silas didn't give him a second chance. The Sharp's rifle spoke again, a definitive final word. The young man collapsed over his horse's neck, then slid unceremoniously into a snowdrift. 2 down. Elias Merton was a different breed. He wasn't a panicked youth, he was a cornered wolf. He roared in fury and dove for the cover of the horses, firing his own revolver blindly into the smoke. "Tucker, get around here, kill him!" Silas had already abandoned his position, rolling to his right, using the swirling blizzard as his ally. He was a ghost in the gale, visible one moment, gone the next. He knew that staying in one place was death. From the back of the cabin, Tucker appeared, his face red and blistered from the scalding water, howling with rage. He saw Silas's fleeting shape and fired the bullet, kicking up snow just inches from Silas's head. This was the moment Abigail had been dreading. She was still in the corner, the smoke thick and acrid in her lungs, making her cough and her eyes stream. Through the open doorway, she saw the scene illuminated in flashes of gunfire. She saw the man named Tucker, his face a mask of hate, leveling his pistol at the spot where Silas had just been. Her fear was a living thing, a cold, coiling serpent in her belly. But the image of that gun, of the death it promised to the only man who had shown her kindness, who stood between her and these monsters, ignited something else. The primal instinct she had felt before, the fierce, protective rage of a mother, swelled within her. She was not a shooter. She was not a fighter. But she was not helpless. Her eyes darted around the smoke-filled room, landing on the hearth. The fire was smothered, but the stones of the fireplace were still radiating a tremendous heat. Beside it lay the iron walker, its tip still glowing a faint, dull red. With a surge of desperate energy, she scrambled to the fireplace. The poker was almost too hot to touch, even on its handle, but she gripped it. Her mind focused on a single desperate idea. Outside, Silas and Tucker were locked in a deadly dance. Tucker advanced, using the corner of the cabin as cover, while Merton laid down, suppressing fire from behind the terrified horses. Silas was pinned down behind a snow-covered log pile. He was outnumbered. It was then that Tucker made his mistake. Believing the fight was entirely outside, he backed up against the cabin's side wall. For better cover, his back pressed right up against the logs just a few feet from the open door. Inside, Abigail heard his heavy breathing, his boots crunching in the snow just on the other side of the thin wooden wall. This was her chance, a single fleeting opportunity. She clutched Jedediah's journal, which she had kept hold of this whole time. Its pages held the key. Before the smoke had filled the room, she had frantically reread the last entry, the words searing themselves into her mind. "Can't let them find Abby, or the map. The star isn't what they think. The real secret is in the rock, the fireplace." She gripped the hot poker. Taking a deep breath that was more smoke than air, she lunged for the doorway. She didn't step outside. Instead, she jabbed the glowing tip of the poker with all her strength into the chinking between the logs, right where she knew Tucker's back would be. The outlaw screamed a high, strangled sound of shock and agony as the superheated iron burned through his thick coat and seared his flesh. He arched his back, stumbling away from the wall, his gun firing uselessly into the sky. That scream was Silas's signal. He rose from behind the log pile, no longer pinned down. The Sharp's rifle boomed a third time. Tucker crumpled to the ground and did not move. Now it was just Merton. The gang leader, seeing his men fall one by one, let out a curse that was snatched away by the wind. He knew he was outmatched in a long-range fight against a tracker with a sharps. He had one option left. He fired his last 2 rounds toward Silas to keep his head down, then broke from the cover of the horses and charged directly for the open cabin door. If he could get inside, take the woman hostage, he could still win. He filled the doorway, a huge, terrifying figure. His face contorted with rage, his empty pistol still clutched in his hand. "Woman!" He bellowed, his eyes finding Abigail through the thinning smoke. "You're my ticket out of here!" He lunged for her. Abigail stumbled backward, her hand going to her belly, the Colt revolver that Silas had given her, feeling impossibly heavy. She raised it, her hands shaking the hammer, seeming to weigh 1,000 pounds. She remembered Silas's words, "Pull the trigger until it's empty." Merton was almost on her, his hand reaching for her. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, a physical blow that rocked her. She pulled it again. And again. The gun bucked in her hands, a pulled, untamable thing. When she opened her eyes, Elias Merton lay on the floor of the cabin. His charge stopped forever. His eyes wide, with a final, ultimate surprise. Silence descended. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind and her own gasping sobs. The smoke began to clear, sucked out the open door into the blizzard. Silas appeared in the doorway, his rifle held at the ready. He took in the scene. Merton's body, Abigail slumped against the wall, the Colt revolver fallen from her hands. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then his eyes went to the fireplace, to the spot where she had stabbed the poker through the wall. He walked over to the hearth, his boots crunching on the debris. He ran his hand over the river stones, his fingers searching. Jedediah's words from the journal echoed in his mind. "The real secret is in the rock." His fingers found it. A single stone, slightly loose, with a small, unnatural groove along its edge. Using the tip of his knife, he pried it out. There was no hollow space behind it, filled with gold coins. There was something else. Embedded deep within the fireplace structure behind the loose stone was a small, flat metal box blackened with soot. Silas worked it free and brought it into the light. It wasn't a lock box. It was a fire-resistant strong box from a stagecoach. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a pile of bullion. It was a single object, an enormous, breathtakingly beautiful star sapphire the size of a goose egg. It shimmered with a deep blue light, a perfect 6-rayed star trapped within its depths. It was magnificent, otherworldly. The Cheyenne Star. It wasn't a payroll. It was a jewel, a private shipment for some wealthy tycoon so valuable it had been given a code name and hidden amongst the regular army payroll. The bullion was a myth, a red herring. The real treasure was this single portable priceless stone. Jedediah had known. He had known the gold was a lie, and he had died for it. A sharp, intense pain shot through Abigail's abdomen, far worse than before. She cried out, doubling over her hands, clutching her belly. The battle was over, but another one was just beginning. Silas looked from the incredible jewel to the woman crying out in pain. The storm still raged, the world was still frozen, and the ghosts of the dead lay silent in the snow. He put the Cheyenne Star down on the mantelpiece, its cold fire seeming to watch them, and went to her side. The loner, the tracker, the killer of men, knelt. His expression softening with a deep and profound concern. her labor had begun. In the aftermath of the storm, as the first rays of a clean, cold dawn pierced through the clouds, a new sound joined the whisper of the wind in the Bighorn Mountains. It wasn't a cry of sorrow, but a cry of life. In a blood-stained cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of greed and betrayal, a child was born. The silent tracker. Silas, a man who had long walked with death, found himself an unlikely midwife, his hands so used to holding a rifle, now holding the fragile promise of a new beginning. The Cheyenne star, with its cold ancient light, sat forgotten on the mantelpiece, its value paling in comparison to the warm, breathing miracle in his arms. Their story doesn't end there. It's a new chapter written in the snow, a story of survival, unlikely family, and redemption. What happened to Abigail, her child, and the quiet man who saved them? What became of the priceless jewel? Those are tales for another time. If their journey through the heart of the storm moved you, if you believe in the strength found in the most desperate of moments, then help us share their story. Please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a tale of the true West, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep finding these lost whispers in the wind and bringing them to you. Thank you for listening.